Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Joshino and today we're going to be talking about that new sword-wielding champion, ZHIN, who has graced the realm of Paladins, and whether or not they're actually any good at the moment. And if you didn't know, ZHIN was actually buffed before he was even released from the PTS, giving an extra 20 units movement speed, which sort of indicates that the developers know that there's something going on with ZHIN, and I'm going to go and elaborate a bit more on why he's not exactly amazing at the moment. So before we get into the nitty gritty, I think that the design of the champion is pretty damn awesome, especially in the animations, in the way they fire, in the way you can spin like Link from Zelda. It brings a lot of nostalgic feelings of RPGs and things like that, and is very cool to play as a concept. But when it comes to the gameplay, there are lots of frustrations. So one of the big things to talk about is his damage per second and his burst potential. Now most of the other flanks rely on their burst to take down an enemy quickly, and a lot of their role is going out to a damage dealer and taking them out in the back lines and then getting out again. Now the first part, the actual burst, ZHIN struggles a lot with. He can do 1600 damage in roughly 2 seconds. He does the first 2 slashes, both 450, so 900, and then that third slash is 700 damage comboed off, and that goes to 1600 damage. Now the way it works is that after the first 2 slashes, you have to slash the third one within 2 seconds to get the bonus damage. But if you actually slash all of them together almost instantly, then it's around a 2-second burst down, which is a pretty pathetic 800 damage per second. The thing is, you do have your whirl, which is an extra 400 damage, which you sort of combo with all of those movements and can bring his damage up, but then again you're locked into the animation and that generally brings down your DPS. And a lot of the champions you can't burst down with only 2000 damage, those first 3 combo shots and then the whirl. It's only the very squishiest of flankers, and when an enemy gets the defensive item Haven, you're likely not to be able to do that combo to burst them down pretty quickly like other flankers would be able to. Another problem with the in-hand damage is the inconsistency of having the comboed 700 at the end. If you miss that 700 shot, which has a different hitbox, I'll also add, the size of the projectile is different because it's vertical, it's smaller than the horizontal ones. It's still quite wide, but it's smaller. If you miss that, then your DPS is completely shattered. It also means it's harder for him to act as a sort of damage dealer and be able to poke and do poke damage to enemies. You do have the bonus of not having any damage drop off, but you also have the fact that the projectile completely disappears at range, so you can't hit people further away, but that you might miss the final shot that's really important, that 700 damage shot, and that can be annoying too. The thing with ZHIN's in-hand damage as well is slash. It's easy close up to hit with because the projectile is so massive horizontally, it can hit somebody relatively easy if you're close to them. But it's so slow that it's really hard to hit anybody that's got any sort of movement. They're fast, or they can fly, or they can jump, or they can move away. It's very hard to get sustained damage on an enemy that's aware of you. Going against a Drogos and Droxus Willow is extremely difficult just because they can completely evade most of your attacks and keep distance from you. But it's not just that, it feels very frustrating when you're slashing around and you're trying to slash an enemy that's low behind, say, one enemy in front. What happens is, because the projectiles are so big, it hits the enemy in front, the one that you don't want to hit, and the other one gets away. So I think these two things, damage-wise, are almost pivotal for most of the flankers. Buck's kind of the exception because he's not so much bursty, but he makes up for it because he has extra life to fight somebody face to face. Now you might argue that ZHIN has his escape with his billow, and that can keep him alive, but whilst he uses a billow he can't attack, whereas the Buck can continue fighting. So that first thing, burst, and then the second thing really is to be able to pick out targets and finish them off. A lot of the flanker's job, in my opinion, is finishing off an enemy, and they're great at getting to enemies. People might be like, oh, you just kill steal from me, but that's what the flank is there to do, to finish people off. That's also compounded by the fact that ZHIN has no vertical movement. It's also a point that Skye really struggles with. They have invisibility, but they can't chase down enemies that get into cover or can go into some vertical movement. They really struggle at taking them down and finishing people off. So ZHIN does have his whirl to try and chase enemies with, and can also be used to whirl into somebody to finish somebody off. And I think that's the greatest tool in his kit at the moment, the whirl, being able to cross quite a distance, especially with the card giving it extra length. The problem is you will often be using it a lot, as I said, to make sure you have the burst potential and you're finishing somebody off when you're dueling them, and it'll be on cooldown. The other thing is that if any other champions have a vertical movement ability like I mentioned before, then they'll just be able to get away and your whirl won't be able to reach them. It'll also mean that you're always going to be in somebody's face and not always in a beneficial position above them, which most of the flankers can take the high ground, like Obi-Wan Kenobi in Revenge of the Sith. The next thing really is the counter ability and how it's kind of useless against anybody with some sense. Now, There's a few problems with the counter ability that aren't just about the ability, but the ability itself is basically a worse version of Androxus Reversal. It's got a very small hitbox in front of you just to your own character's hitbox, and fundamentally people can just either ignore you or try and get behind you and still do some damage. The second thing is, to actually do any damage to an enemy, and for it to be actually any use really, you have to be close enough to them to actually counter an attack. Now most enemies are going to just stop when they see you using it, or move away from you and just shoot it and get rid of it and then carry on firing at you. Most of the time when I've used counter, it's been almost counterproductive because there's a time between when your counter is lowered and you're a bit vulnerable for a second or so after that. Also, if somebody just shoots your counter whilst you're countering and they just get rid of it from a distance, then you're completely vulnerable still. It hasn't really helped. There is a counter build with a card where it heals you 400 health every time somebody makes you swing the sword during the counter. And whilst it was kind of funny in some of the Onslaught matches where there wasn't any matchmaking, if you actually go into the casual games I was playing, nobody was shooting the counter, nobody was getting it to go off, so it was pretty much dead in the water and useless. What I touched on there was a bit of the frustration with animations because of the way counter doesn't finish straight away. There's a bit of a time at the end where you can't fire or you can't move or use abilities. The same happens sometimes when you're trying to use Billow. There's a bit of a delay, or there's a bit of delay after you've fired. Generally the animations don't feel that fluid on ZHIN and can be part of the frustration with playing the champion. On Billow there's not much to say about it, it's an escape. The only thing is that it's frustrating not to be able to jump during the Billow. It's kind of annoying, but really it does seem that the only way to play ZHIN at the moment and be useful is to have the Billow legendary and heal up during it, and just be extremely aggressive playing the ZHIN to make sure you get off your damage, and then to use the Billow to disengage and heal up. But the thing is, when you're using Billow, a lot of the time you're actually healing up, you're out of the combat, you're not able to finish somebody off, and it gives a chance to an enemy to get out of combat and heal up themselves. I found a lot of times where I've been chasing after an enemy, but I would have 100% been killed if I'd have tried to chase the enemy. But even though they were low, because of the time between my slashes or my whirl being off cooldown, and I knew I had to go into my Billow. But whilst I was in the Billow, I was watching the enemy heal up because I was unable to finish them off, and then just hoping that they'd be lower than when I first engaged them on the first try. But that's just a problem with ZHIN's burst at the moment. ZHIN's ultimate is nothing to write home about, but I don't think ultimates are like the biggest linchpin in Paladins, and it can be useful in certain engagements, especially without the legendary card, using it against a squishy champion, just making sure you kill them if they're close to you. The only thing is it's quite hard to hit and you're locked into it, and that is kind of frustrating in and of itself. There is a legendary card that gives you a 25% max HP on each slash, which is a pretty much guaranteed kill as long as you don't get shot down whilst using the ultimate, but I just don't think it's worth it in the grand scheme of things compared to the other things you can pick up, well, mainly just the Billow legendary. I think the central thing about ZHIN at the moment is he does nothing the other flankers can do better, and he doesn't have enough damage or doesn't have enough poke to be able to be classed as an almost damage flank like Lex is, and fill a role that Cassie almost shares with a flex between flank and damage. And I feel that he will be easier to use for newer people to the game, people that don't necessarily have great aim because the projectiles are so big, and because people will be less aware and reactive to you, but savvy players will just be able to counter him pretty damn easily. One of the things I think that without reworking him completely could make him slightly better without any direct buffs is getting rid of being stuck in a lot of the move, because part of the problem is that not only does he have low DPS, but he's out of the action for so long. Like for saying, when he goes into Billow, he has to be in the Billow for the full time, and if an enemy can go and heal, he could have actually come out of the Billow and maybe finished them off and been a bit more unpredictable that way. Also, when you're using the counter, you can't come out of the counter once you've used it, but also you've got that weird animation at the end of it where you can just die because you can't do anything. And the same thing with some of the attacks, there seems to be a bit of a weirdness in the animation at the end. And if they made things a bit more smooth and everything going off almost instantly, giving you a bit more control, that could be something that could make him more viable than he is at the moment. Obviously, thinking about having some vertical movement, whether he spins upwards, he can go where he's facing with a spin, or something like that could be an option, because obviously it's quite important as a flanker being able to chase after people, finish them off, or even getting to enemies that are on high ground that isn't accessible from one side. I know Pawn.com, whilst he was on the PTS, was saying that the counter should be default, the legendary card where basically you keep countering, you don't come out of counter, because when a projectile hits you counter normally, you just swing and then you're out of it. but instead having that default so you can hold it as long as possible, maybe even come out of it whilst you're holding it, could be an option that could make him more viable, just give him more escape. But I don't think necessarily that was the problem he was having, and counters one of the weakest abilities anyway. If you are paying attention and you're not firing at it, you can just ignore him and then fire afterwards. It could be slightly increasing the speed at which he does his slashes, or very slightly increasing the damage. Maybe even a better way to combo the whirl so you can have an extra 400 damage almost instantly coming back again, so that he actually does have some burst. But anyway, those are pretty much my feelings on ZHIN at the moment. He's quite frustrating to play, but has a pretty damn cool core concept, which is frustrating because you want the champion to actually work out. Anyway, what does everybody else think? Be sure to let me know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and I'll see you all next time. Joshino.